Staying with Donna worked out very well because Mary wouldn't hear of staying with my folks. When she first encountered them, Glenn had one of his fits of anger, and Mary had never witnessed anything like that before, and she told me then and there that she wasn't going to stay there while I was gone. So I got in touch with Donna. I had introduced her in at Aunt Esther's when we got to Portland, and she volunteered to let Mary stay with her and her mother. So that worked out beautifully. She wasn't far from Astoria, and when I got back to Tongue Point, reported for duty at Tongue Point, why, it was easy for her to move her things to Astoria, where we got a place to stay. This was nothing great. It was so-called trailers that were built that I guess they had axles under them, but only to move them to the location where they were. There was a trailer campsite with washrooms set up just for this purpose, for military purposes. And we were able to rent these little shacky wooden trailers for a reasonable price. So we'd ride back and forth to the base every day, as Mary got a job on the base as, of all things, a metalsmith working on repairing aircraft. These aircraft weren't able to land or take off there at Tongue Point because there was no runway, but they were trucked in, and they were all small fighter-type aircraft that needed repairs done. So she and another girl, were the main sheet metal people in the shop there. They learned all about drilling holes and bucking rivets, cutting pieces of aluminum and shaping it. So it was quite a little on-the-job training for them. In the meantime, I was down at the other end of the base working on the line maintenance school for the PB-4Ys. I believe they were called Liberators. Now, this PB-4Y didn't have the kind of radar that I'd been used to working on, even though I had been trained on it in Corpus Christi. But it didn't take long for me to bone up on the two pieces of equipment that we had that were used in these aircraft. And instead of being slung under the wing, they were up on top of the plane under what was called a radome, a dome that covered the radar antenna and equipment. everything was under that radome except for the indicators, the consoles, what were called the PPI scopes, or plan position indicator scopes, that were down inside the plane for the navigator to use. Now this was primarily search radar. There was no intercept involved with it because these were bombers. And all they wanted to know was what the topography was on the ground below and what aircraft were in the air approaching them. There was another piece of equipment in there that George Thatcher worked on called IFF, or Identification Friend or Foe, which worked most of the time and allowed these aircraft to tell when another aircraft in the area was friendly or not. In the fall of 1945, when the war ended, there was no more need for a line maintenance school, so we shut it down. Everything was packed up and shipped away, and Mary and I were given orders to return to Corpus Christi, Ward Island. This seemed like kind of a waste to me, but I was signed up for the duration plus 6 months. So I had my 6 months to go yet. And since they had need for me, supposedly, in Corpus Christi, that was what we were going to do. It was while we were in the latter part of our stay in Astoria at Tongue Point, one of the fellows was being transferred out, and earlier than the rest of us, he put in for a transfer, and he had a little Plymouth coupe, 1937 Plymouth coupe, dark blue, that he was willing to sell when he left. I guess he wasn't being transferred, come to think of it. He was being discharged. So we bought the car from him, and one of the first things that I did was to take it and Mary out to some back roads near Astoria and teach her to drive. Because I thought, if we're going to drive all the way to Texas in this, I want somebody to be able to take the wheel part of the time. So Mary learned how to drive. Now, they always say that a husband should not teach a wife how to drive. And this was just as true in our case as for anyone else. But somehow it didn't quite manage to end in divorce, although it came close, I think, at times. Mary did learn how to drive, and drive well. The day before we left, I decided to buy a kit that would allow me to put seal beam headlights on the car. I thought that would be much better to make that trip with seal beams rather than the old-fashioned bulbs that the car came with. So I bought the kit that was supposed to fit, took it home, and started to install them. What a nightmare that was. The things didn't quite fit, and I had to form and fool around with the bezels that held the bulbs in, headlight units, and put sealer around because the crimping would have allowed rain to enter around the bulbs, around the units. And I think it was almost midnight, the day before we were ready to leave, that I got those seal beams in and working. Aside from having to stop in one of the towns to get another tire, and going through the hassle of making arrangements with the rationing board there in order to purchase the tire, get it replaced. The trip was more or less uneventful. We arrived back in Corpus Christi, and I reported to the base. It was really nice to be able to drive out there in my own vehicle. And we got settled in town and had an apartment at Mrs. Singletary's place. And it was really nice because we had our own garage to put the car in. We found that it was cheaper to leave the car there during the day, and I'd take the bus out to the base rather than having the hassle of the car. I can remember driving to main base and going out to the survey yard where they were smashing all of the electronic components, electronic equipment that was now surplus. Bulldozers would roll over this equipment and push it into the sand, and we'd go out and dig it up and brush the sand away, load it into the car. When I say we, I'm talking about another fellow and I that we got acquainted with when we got to Corpus Christi. He and his wife. Don't recall their names anymore, though. But we'd get equipment this way. It was smashed, and then take it home and use a little hand drill to drill the rivets out of the cases. We got enough rivets drilled out, then we could pull the cases off and get to the components on the inside. And this was great fun. We'd salvage all kinds of parts and tube sockets and of course the vacuum tubes were all smashed, but we didn't care. We were getting parts for radios, and for free. Just a little labor involved in salvaging them. In a used radio store, I found an old radio that the owner gave me because he couldn't make it work. It was too old. Well, I worked and worked on that radio. It had no power supply, so I built a power supply and almost got it to working by the time we left there. I installed it in the car, but it didn't quite make the grade.